Announcing the arrival of our honorable guest, members of the hall, please arise. Please remain standing for the Malaysian national anthem, Negaraku. Please be seated.
Yang berbahagia Dato' IR Dr. Abdul Rahim Haji Hashim, Vice Chancellor of the University of Malaya, Ms. Alison Jong, Convener of the Malaya Australasian Intervarsity Debating Championship 2018, Mr. Tony Nagamaya, General Manager, Malaysia Major Events, Division of Malaysia Convention and Exhibition Bureau, MISAP, Professor Dr. Faisal Rafiq Muhammad Adikan, Deputy Vice Chancellor Development and Acting Deputy Vice Chancellor of Student Affairs and Alumni, Associate Professor Dr. Chandran Somasundram, Chairman of Malaya Australs 2018, cum Executive Advisor of the Malaysian Institute for Debate and Public Speaking, MIDP, and Mr. Yunus Zakaria, Chief Operating Officer, Haro Sports and Entertainment. Good evening, everyone. Salam Reformasi and Salam Malaysia Baru. Welcome to the Grand Finals and Championship Dinner of Malaya Australasian Intervarsity Debating Championship 2018.
The Australasian Intervarsity Debating Championship is one of the world's largest debating tournaments, second only in size to the World Universities Debating Championship, WUDC, the European Universities Debating Championships, EUDC, and one of the world's largest annual student event in the world. For this year's Malaya Australs, we are honored and extremely excited to have hosted 40 institutions from 10 different countries. This year's Australs has seen one of the most diverse pool of talents from around the Asia-Pacific region, and we are so proud that it happened here in Malaysia.
Members of the hall, now it's time to move on to the Open Grand Finals of Malaya Australs 2018. Without further ado, we would like to introduce our panel of judges.
All right, state your name and power.
The chair of the debate, Vinodan Kupusami from Malaysia. Amrit Agastya from Malaysia. From Australia, we have Jessica Musulin. We have Mifsal Muhammad from Malaysia. Bobby Andika Riutang from Indonesia. Maddie Nash from Australia. Tausif Khan from Bangladesh, Rafi Marshall from the United Kingdom, and Yi Anshi from Singapore.
Now we present to you our finalists. Please give a huge round of applause on affirmative bench from Australia, the University of Sydney Union. On the negative bench, please give a huge round of applause from Australia, Macquarie University. Introducing our Prime Minister for today, Ms. Stephanie White. The Deputy Prime Minister, Mr. James Stratton. The Affirmative Whip, Ms. Imogen Harper. As the Leader of Opposition, we have Jacob Rock. Deputy Leader of Opposition, we have Georgia Chahoud. And the Negative Whip, we have Ben Jackson.
Now, please welcome the Chair, Mr. Vinodan Kupusamy, Chief Adjudicator, to proceed with the Open Grand Finals of Malaya Australs 2018.
Yeah, hello everyone, I'm Vinod. Hello. Okay, without further ado, on the motion that if it existed, we would support a non-sentient artificial intelligence that imitated deceased loved ones in appearance, personality, and mannerism. And can we have the first affirmative speaker to start off the debate? Here.
So loud. Can I move this back? Grief kills. The mortality rate of the elderly spikes after they lose a partner. We can never replace the dead on side affirmative, and our team does not try to. But we can provide people with an important totem through which they can say goodbye, and that is why we support this technology. Firstly, a few points by way of setup. This debate is not a question of banning or black markets and whether or not this technology will be legal. What we're saying is that we will not proselytize for or against this policy, but we hold that the provision of this technology is a benefit and it will do net good for the world. By way of what this technology looks like, we think it will be a perfect mimicry of that person in terms of personality, appearance, mannerisms, and so forth, but it will not be sentient artificial intelligence. We would require, if this were to technology mimicking an adult, that the person who is being mimicked consented before they died to that. If it were a child, we would require that their parent consented. We think that people are likely to use this technology for varying periods of time. So it could be to request a day or a week with a child that was gone too soon, or it could be for an elderly person living out the final year of their life with their partner who was their best friend in the world for 60 years. 3 arguments in this speech. Firstly, why principally individuals have a right to access this means of grieving. Secondly, why this relieves the sting of grief for those in incredible pain and helps them recover. And thirdly, why it is far better than the alternative mechanisms of grieving that individuals will resort to. So firstly, on the principle. We would say firstly that this expands the set of possible options for people experiencing the shock of grief, which for many is the most traumatic experience that they will go through in their life. We say that grief is incredibly subjective and personal, and we should not judge how they choose to go about dealing with that trauma, because people currently react in many ways that may appear counterproductive to those around them, but make perfect sense to them. Things like locking themselves away in a room and crying for a week, things like throwing themselves into their work and trying not to think of their loved ones. That means that we ought to maximize the choice provided to those who are going through this experience, because they are the ones that will choose what is best for them. Secondly, we think that people are able to make this choice because they're likely to have knowledge about themselves and how grief has affected them, because many people practice grief from an early age, be that through grandparents or other people they know who leave them. But we will also say that they will see others using this technology in a world in which it exists and see others not using this technology, which means they will likely have access to the information about how it will affect other people. We also think that when people are going through a grieving process, particularly if it is an incredibly traumatic one, that they will often have access to a support network, be that informal by way of family or professional in terms of counselling, that will help them make this decision and ensure that they do mean what they choose. But also that this is likely to be seen as quite an extreme step and therefore something that others will ensure that they consider appropriately. But we do not think that people are likely to be coerced into this choice, because we think that people see grief as incredibly personal and subjective and private, and therefore they are unlikely to judge the decisions that people make either way and coerce them in or out of this technology. The evidence for that is that people make exceptions for those experiencing grief. They say that it is understandable that they are reacting with anger or reacting with silence or reacting with stoicism, and that people are willing to see that this is something that people do in incredibly private and diverse ways. That's why we ought maximize the way in which people can choose to exercise what is probably an incredibly difficult time for them, and we should not judge what means they use to go about that. Second argument is why this relieves the sting of grief for those in incredible pain and assists with recovery in an important way. We think that the people who opt into this technology will often have incredibly strong reasons why they can't move on in other ways, and therefore it is important that we allow them to use this technology. So for example, elderly people who have lost their partner, who have no one else in the world and literally cannot imagine waking up every day without making a cup of tea with the person they were married to for 50 years. The first part of this argument is that this is something but which people do already to a large extent, but in a way which is quite ineffective and harmful or counterproductive to a particular extent. So things like constantly looking at photographs of people who have died, things like reliving memories of what it was like to live with them, but the aspects of that which make people unhappy or which prevent them from coming to terms with what have happened is not the recollection itself. You never hear someone say, "I wish I had less photos." It is the fact that that is not complete. It is people saying, "I cannot believe that I've let myself forget what color their eyes were or what their smile looks like." People blame themselves for imperfect recollection in a way that makes them incredibly unhappy, but also makes them feel incredibly guilty. They're also likely to worry about how that person would feel or what they would think about their current life choices. And because people going through grief are likely to have incredible levels of self-doubt and be in a very bad place, they're likely to default to the position that that person would judge them for what they were doing, and that in addition makes them feel guilty. Whereas if they have access to this mimicry, they are not only able to have a perfect recollection of that person, which prevents those feelings of guilt, they are able to talk to this person or this AI, which has that personality, and ask what they would feel by accessing that mimicry. Secondly, this helps in the short-term recovery process of grief. Firstly, because in many cases, the keenest sting of grief is not the fact that that person has died, it is the initial shock to the drastic change in your life that results as a result of that person dying. That person is no longer there, that there is a hole in your bed next to you, or that child who you had carried for 9 months will not ever be someone that you will hold in your arms. We see that in the way that it is common practice or prevailing practice to give stillborn children to their parents to hold and say goodbye. The way that many cultures in the world have opened caskets for one last goodbye. The fact that we say goodbye to people on their deathbed and do not hide the incredibly ill from their family because we recognize the importance of a gradual change in people's understanding of their experiences rather than a binary change in what their lives are like. This mechanism allows them to have that finality and safety, that fulfillment and that familiarity and safety while they process the intellectual knowledge that that person has passed away. Secondly, we think that people often meet grief with incredible anger at the person who has passed away. They ask, why did you leave me like this? How dare you do this to me in my time of need? And that often resolves into grief and shame after the initial shock. But now you're able to have a conversation with that person where they reassure you that they did love you, that you should not feel guilty. Lastly, this is better in the long term for recovery. Firstly, because grief is often a source of very real practical effect for individuals, such as elderly people who now live alone and are much more likely to die, maybe not literally of that loneliness, but at least in a very real sense of that loneliness. Secondly, because it makes individuals less likely to romanticize someone in an unhealthy way, which then stops you from moving on, because you have access to that individual at a point in time where you are more rational than you are just in your initial memory. But lastly, because it gives you an opportunity to say goodbye, which you would resent the lack of in the alternative. Fourthly, this won't lead to an unhealthy obsession with this person. Firstly, because people know that this is artificial intelligence and therefore not sentient, meaning that they will not think that they can fill the role of the real person. They will instead see it as providing information or experiences of that person. The evidence of that is the way that people talk about their loved ones, not as a body or as a machine, but as a person with a soul with which they have a real connection. And that will mean they will not think that they can fall in love with this AI. They will see it as something helping them to move on. Secondly, there are many other rituals of death that will act as a circuit breaker. Things like funeral planning or things like legal proceedings, which mean that you cannot avoid the intellectual knowledge that person is gone. And lastly, the vast majority of people will want to move on with their lives. And if it is so important to them that they want to keep this person around forever, we will contend on the affirmative that it is probably the case that getting over them in the literal sense is probably a harm for that person. If they choose, they would be happier with this mimicry. Death is horrible and people feel pain. We think that providing this totem can allow people at least some salve in the immediate shock of what has happened to them, and we are incredibly proud to support this technology.
I thank the first affirmative speaker. Can I have the first negative speaker?
Had to kill your partner, either you never would or it would break you. I think that their claim that people will just take a moment to say goodbye is one that just belies the reality of what people had to do. They created a being for which you were causally responsible, for which you, in a very literal sense, were responsible for ensuring the propagation of its existence. And then they just presumed that you would look at your child, you would see it for a day, and you would say, no, that's enough, I'm done. I think that is incredibly unlikely and a thing that is likely to tear people apart if they were able to do it as they watched their child die. But more than that, it was worse the second time because you did it. You were responsible for that death. You were responsible for the thing that gave you support no longer being with you, but instead being taken away. And I think that would break people and ruin their lives in ways that are unconscionable. So I'm going to do a little bit of setup. I'm going to talk about consent. I'm going to talk about why you can't move on. And I'm going to talk about why you had to. On the first question about what we think it is, I think this thing has to be a robot. It's not sentient. That means that it can't adapt and change in ways that are important for a person to exist. I think that it can't adapt for two reasons. One, you need a conception of your own worth in order to develop. The way that moral beings exist is that they're able to value themselves and they're able to make judgments from that position, which this thing lacks because it lacks sentience. Two, you need emotion to develop, and AIs don't have that. They emote rather than having feelings. What the consequence of that claim is then is that they are able to appear sentient but are not. That means that you can't have the long-term relationships they tried to suggest that people would have. It means if you were the old couple that they were concerned about, what the people were left was a shallow mimicry of what things used to be, but are not able to grow and develop in ways that were important. On the second question then, of are you able to consent to this kind of thing? The claim that they make is that people are able to understand grief and that they can choose for themselves this is the best thing for them to do. But importantly, I think that is incredibly implausible. Because in general, I would think that when people are going through this grieving process, they're in a time of extreme emotional vulnerability. This makes people act in irrational ways all the time. Think of the fights that people have at funerals and about inheritances. Think of the battles that people are willing to wage in memory of their friends. Think of how often people are willing to lose relationships in those kinds of times in ways that they're likely to regret later. All of these things are likely to combine to mean that people could not consent on that basis. But more than that, I think it's important to note that people are likely to feel pressured by others in ways that make that consent particularly unlikely. This is true because remember, when you create this person that you had a relationship with, others also had a relationship with them. Everyone else around them had a relationship with this person and are likely to have incredibly powerful beliefs as to whether you should create this or not. I think that what that means is you're far less likely to be able to only rationally consider your own interests, but also you'll be pressured by the people around you to make choices that otherwise you would not be willing to. On the third question then, of can you move on, and why do we think that you could not? I think that in general, to move on, you need two things. The first one is an ability to let these memories fade. Steph told you that people often feel guilty or reluctant when people's memories slowly decline, but I think that is an incredible blessing and a thing that enables people to move on in ways when otherwise they could not. What they had to defend on their world was a complete, singular severance of your entire relationship with this person. All of your memories about them all of a sudden were entirely real, and then you let them go. And I think that's a much harder thing to do with. It's a much harder thing to move on in that kind of world than a world when you can slowly forget a person. You can forget individual aspects of them and you can gradually sever that emotional tie. The second thing that I think that you need is familial support. You need the people around you to be able to act as a support network to try and defend the choices that you had made. You're also incredibly unlikely to have that in a world where you've acted in a way where you've created a new being in order for you to help move it on. Because I think that in that world, you're incredibly likely to have other family members likely to pressure you. They're likely to see it as being anti-religious. They're likely to see it as an offense to the things that are sacred in somebody's life and their being. Other people are likely to, in many cases, also not want it to move on. Not want you to let it go first, but want you to keep it around so they can move on as well. And the consequence of both of those claims then is that you're likely to lose the familial support that was necessary for people to be able to move on in ways that were effective. The second claim that I would make about why you're unlikely to move on is because you've created a being for which you are entirely responsible. You created habits that mean you need to react with it and interact with it in ways that are specific and very particular. And once you fell into those kinds of habits, losing them is just as painful as losing them the first time was, because it was the loss of those routines that hurt you, as Steph herself tells you. Thirdly, you need to literally kill this being. It is important to note, this being existed and could not exist without you. In order for you to move on, you have to physically pull the plug. You have to look at your relative and go, I'm done, I'm sorry, goodbye. And that imposes a level of moral culpability that would be incredibly traumatic for people to have to deal with. You have to deal with incredible levels of hurt. Fourthly, this being itself has emotions. Anytime you tried to move on, and the moving on process probably involves talking more with other people and less with it, it probably cares. if it mimics emotions, it's also going to mimic the jealousy. It's going to mimic the hatred that it's likely to feel as you spend less and less time with it. It's going to resent you as you tell it that it is not real. It's going to resent you as it tries to move away. What all of those things combine to mean is that it's incredibly hard to move on once this being exists, because people feel a sense of obligation towards it. People feel a sense of need to try and preserve it. Lastly, on why this relationship is likely to be specifically unfulfilling. I think it is important to note, the first thing important to note, the robot is fake, and a part of you knows that. So every time you interact with this being, you're going to have a sense of doubt about what could have been. Especially when you've replicated a child, you've replicated a partner, some part of you will wonder if it was possible that something else could have happened. This isn't the entirety of you, this isn't your entire rational being, but some part of you probably just has this niggling doubt of would they have developed this way in the real world, or is it just the AI that's acting, which means that relationship is likely to be really unfulfilling. Secondly, relationships rely on dynamic change in order to be effective. I think it's really important to remember that the reason that people value each other, the reason they can keep talking to each other is because they're able to grow and develop as individuals. They're able to have different thoughts, different perspectives as they've grown older and wiser. And those are the kinds of things that you lose with an AI, which can't do those things. All that it was doing was mimicking the exact moment that existed at the point at which that moment occurred. And so that means it's likely to be ineffective. Thirdly, you're likely to be reminded of your grief. I think it's important to remember that one of the things that is most impactful when you can think about someone when they have died is the moment of their death. Because that is the moment when you probably feel the greatest single emotional charge in your relationship with them. Because the entirety of your relationship is gone. That creates an incredible hole in people's lives and emotions. What that means is, when you see them in the future, some part of you is always going to be brought back to the moment when they died. Some part of you is always going to be brought back to the moment when they were incredibly hurt. And so if you can't get away from that, that's likely to be incredibly hurtful and a thing that people are likely to loathe. Fourthly, I think that this thing is likely to have to be static in ways that are harmful. Every change that this thing exhibits, every time the AI acts imperfectly, and I think it is important to note the AI is likely to act imperfectly, is the thing that you have to see as illegitimate because you see it as being a copy, and therefore any change or development is a thing that is seen as being intrinsically flawed. That is an outcome that leaves you with a sense of loss. Because I told you that you can't move on. Your family is likely to resent you for it, and you've lost those emotional supports. At the same time, you can't stay with it because it hurts you every time you see it. We would regret this.
I thank the first negative speaker. Can I have the second affirmative speaker?
Test. In some senses, the negative team are right. An automaton will not be able to grow and adapt in the way that a real human would. But sometimes a pale imitation of life is more than enough for us to say goodbye to. Family members fly across the world to say goodbye to a lifeless father or a lifeless sister, even if in some cases they cannot really be sure whether or not that person is hearing what they are saying. Because what's valuable to them isn't necessarily what the recipient feels, it's their opportunity to reconcile themselves with their memories. And a totem of life is what allows people that opportunity. I'm firstly going to look at whether people can consent to the use of this new technology. This is a very important aspect of the debate because people experience grief subjectively in very different ways. And that means that expanding the set of possible options which people use to deal with their grief can only be beneficial in this debate if we can prove that people will use this technology in the right circumstances. The negative team says people will make bad decisions because people are very irrational at the time of grief. When a loved one dies, people are incredibly upset, but they're still able to consider closely their future and their feelings. For instance, when people deal with questions of euthanasia, when they decide to attend someone's funeral, even though that will be very emotionally distressing for them, that's because they acknowledge that their feelings, though deeply held, are things that they can think about the long term of. But even if people are irrational in a moment of grieving, people have a right to make decisions in the moment. And it's, in fact, when people feel the greatest intensity of emotion, that it's likely that they will make the best decisions about whether or not they'd prefer that person to be with them. Because grieving doesn't go away after the first month of death, which is what you have to believe is right to believe the negative team's claim that people who make a decision on day 1 will make a decision that's wrong as of day 30. Often that state of grief is not just transient, it's a state of grief that will be with them for a long time to come. So it's right for people to make decisions at exactly that moment. Alternatively, they argue, well, someone's family might pressure them, for instance, if they object for religious reasons. Firstly, in many cases, we're talking about private use of this individual, like, for instance, having that loved one around you at home. Secondly, even if the family knows about it and cares about it, it's unlikely they'll pressure you into it because people acknowledge that people feel grief very differently. For example, in families where different people within the family have differing religious faiths, we don't often see funeral fights as to which religious faith the funeral should adopt, because people understand that the most important thing is dealing with grief rather than necessarily following the particular religious faith that that person has. Lastly, though, note that this line of argument that people will be pressured out of using this technology clearly can't win the negative team the debate, because the worst that can happen when being pressured out of using the technology is the status quo of not having someone to say goodbye to, whereas at least under our side, a large number of people will have the benefit of saying goodbye to someone. That's why people will make good choices. Let's secondly ask which side is going to be better for grieving. The negative team's main line of argument is that you'll never get rid of this person because it will feel to you like murder. Clearly, this is not murder because this is not a sentient being. It's an imitation, closer to a photo or a video. So the question is, will it be easy for the user to understand that what they're doing is morally distinct from getting rid of that person? We think it will be easy to understand. Firstly, because they have taken the steps to actively creating that person, which means that it will be clear that ending that robot, which means that clearly there will be a difference between ending the imitation and ending the thing that it was imitating. Secondly, because it's likely that people will be used to this technology. People practice grieving from a very young age, which is why children are encouraged to attend funerals, even if distant relatives, so they can understand what's happening. It's likely the same practices will apply to this technology. Thirdly, there are other indicia of the fact that the life of that person has ended, like the fact of a funeral, or like the nibbling doubt that Jacob is talking about. People are going to gradually, initially, be dependent on technology as a way to replicate what they had before, but grow to accept that it cannot replicate what they had. What I want to emphasize that's very valuable is that our side is a challenging but ultimately acceptable way to say goodbye, where someone walks out of the room and you know that you will never see the replica of that person again. By contrast, the negative team's version of saying goodbye is crippling for many people throughout the rest of your lives. It means the last moment you see your child being the day they walk out to university and not having the opportunity to tell them how much you loved them before they happen to be involved in a traffic accident. It means ending your conclusion with someone on a daily moment without meaning, without having the opportunity to say in what ways you valued them. And that's why our way of saying goodbye is much preferable. Then the negative team suggests, well, the problem is that people are likely to be jealous. It'll bind you and it'll want you to get really close to it. As I've already explained, it's likely that people will see these creations as being different. And it's also very unlikely that that a replica of someone who has been deceased, when they come back to life and are informed that they are dead, requires that the other person, for example, not go out on the dating scene again. That would be a very unlikely response from someone who's informed of the end of their life, that they would require that partner remain monogamous to them. If anything, we think it'll make it easier for you to understand you can adapt and form new relationships. Because the status quo is, people find it very difficult to accept, well, would my deceased partner be happy for me to enter upon those new relationships? And people often feel an incredible amount of guilt about that. But when you can have a conversation with your deceased partner, who's very likely to say, I understand you have needs, and I would prefer you to be happy in a new relationship, it's easier for you to go out and form those new valuable emotional bonds. Then the negative team says, won't be a positive adaptation for many people because it's not capable of growing and adapting. I've already explained that even a lifeless imitation is better than no imitation at all. But often when we remember the deceased, we don't look for the dynamics of their personality. We want to remember the most important moments of our relationship with them. We want to say goodbye. We want to remember the places we were happiest. It is so much easier to do that with a real replica of the person than merely a photo. Lastly, the negative team says, and I think this is the crux of the broad brushstroke of what they're getting at, that people need a real shock to their system to act as a circuit breaker and to deal with grief. Firstly, we refute that shocks to the system are a requirement for psychological health. For instance, some people are much better prepared for death than others. For example, when parents die of a stroke at 50, we don't see their children generally deal with it a lot better because it's a bigger shock, compared to children who know that their parents are suffering from a long-term chronic illness and that means that their mortality rate is relatively high over a short-term time horizon. That's because often a large psychological shock is the thing that sets us back. It walls us off from our grief and encourages us not to accept what's happening. It means that we blame ourselves or blame those around us. By contrast, having a comforting way that people can have that conversation with the person who left them allows them to ease their way into that shock. Because there will still be a surprise when someone dies, there will still be funeral rites, it's just that it will be easier to understand and acknowledge what happened when you can have that last farewell. The last thing that I want to add in my substantive is that alternative ways in which people try to live out their grief are much more harmful for themselves and for society. The set of people who we're talking about in this debate are the set of people who are so devoted to their loved ones, they feel as though it is a necessity for them to have a replica of that loved one around them. That desire does not elapse when they cannot access this technology. In many cases, it means turning another human being into a replica. Think, for instance, of parents who have a child who die relatively young and live out the rest of their lives wishing that their other children could act just like them, or elderly individuals who marry a new partner wishing that they could be a little bit more than their old one. That is an incredibly abusive way not just to treat their own emotions, but also to treat those around them, since it turns those other people into replicas of their grief. We would live in a better world in which people could reconcile their relationship with one person before moving on to a relationship with another. And that is the escape that our side is offering to the bereaved.
Thank you, second affirmative speaker. Can we have the second negative speaker?
Panel, I think I would be uncomfortable shooting a picture of my mother, let alone looking a pale imitation that is a perfect mimicry of her in the eye, and looking somebody else and saying, turn her off, I'm finished. I think this team misses how grief kills people when they wanted to make you the very murderer in this instance instead of letting you fall away from that memory naturally. Let's look at their first push, which is that we should unambiguously endorse things that people consent to. They give us 3 reasons why you can consent. One is that you practice grief and you're good at it. Obviously, that's contingent on you practicing grief. I would say for a lot of people, the first time you do grieve is incredibly traumatizing and scary. Not everybody has a grandparent die at a young age. But secondly, I think they respond to this themselves when they say that grief is unique and personal. I would say it is unique and personal on the person that died. You probably grieved your grandparents differently to how you grieved your partner. I would say that that skill is not transferable. The very void they leave in your life is unique and hard to fill, and the way you will fill it will be unique and personal every time. You are not equipped to make that decision. Their second claim is that you have a support network that helps you do that. Obviously, the professional support network is contingent on you accessing counselling, which we know many people don't by their own analysis because they provide us reasons as to why people commit suicide, for example, or die and turn to unhealthy coping mechanisms, which suggest they're not accessing that. But their better claim is that they turn to their family. This ignores Jacob's speech. People won't agree with your choice necessarily. We give you reasons, for example, to suggest that people will be angry at your decision to bring that person back, that people will be afraid when they see this perfect mimicry walk out after you saw them dead in a casket. That would be incredibly traumatizing to wheel out at a family reunion. I think that was probably not something that everyone is going to unambiguously endorse. But even if that wasn't true, Some people will disagree with your decision to turn it off. Maybe you, the wife, can get past that, but their sister cannot. Their mother can't farewell their child, but the father can. That's going to cause a lot of family friction that causes people to drive each other apart, to call each other murderers, to take away their only thing which they claimed was the only thing that could loosen that grief in the first instance. Not only did you hate yourself, you hated everyone around you who was going to help you through that grief process. You were no longer united. But even if you all magically agreed on these huge ethical decisions, you are probably going to retreat into that person if you keep them alive in perpetuity, as they suggest. And if you agree to turn them off, people will think you're done, that it's over. You said goodbye and you should be finished now. And that wasn't helpful with your grieving process. You were still going through that. Even though you got to say goodbye, you're probably not done. And that didn't help people at all either. So we thought it was probably unlikely that they could consent for those reasons. And we gave you some pretty good ones as well to suggest that they probably couldn't consent. We told you that people were very emotional in a particularly traumatizing way at the time that people die. They tell us that some people can make decisions at this time. Some people can't. Some people turn to alcoholism. Some people kill themselves. Some people are simply unable to access that level of rationality. And sometimes you think you are being rational when you keep their clothes, for example, and you can't leave your room without smelling their jacket. You perceive yourself as rational, for example, when you keep your husband's shoes thinking he'll come back for them. People see themselves as rational, but are not. And that was the harm in this case, because they entered into this incredibly traumatic process thinking they were in control when they were not. They thought they would be able to say goodbye after one day, but you always wanted more. You wanted another minute, you wanted another hour, and you couldn't get that necessarily. Their second claim is that they could have been turning to worse coping mechanisms, like, for example, taking on another partner and treating them the same. That suggests to me that people handle replicas badly, that you fill a void and you expect them to be the same and then you can't part from that image. Except when you took on another partner, they were a new and dynamic person. They had a different personality. Your kid was different. And so they were likely to help you get over that grieving process in the first instance. So it is probably pretty clear that this was going to be traumatizing, that this was going to affect people in irrevocable ways. Let's look now at moving on. But I didn't turn on my timer, so I'm going to take one from the bench. We're back. Okay, their first claim is that this loosens the sting of transition. I think that's contingent, for example, on proving people can move on, which by their own analysis suggests that they probably can't, as I've proven in my first issue, but also they acknowledge that some people will not turn these replicas on, so this is probably not consistent for everyone. We also suggest that a process of loosening a sting, for example, is not necessarily good. Jacob gives you a few good reasons to suggest that a finality is something that is probably important, and I think Steph provides them. You let a mother hold her stillborn so she can accept her child has died because she can see the dead body. We have open caskets so you can look your loved one in the eye as they are died and can come to terms with the fact that they're no longer here. They're not animate anymore, and even though you didn't get to say goodbye, you can now make peace with the fact that they're no longer with you. That suggested to me you need a closure. You needed something final to know that they had died, so they weren't living on in your memory in an incredibly problematic way. You lost that when you made this mimicry because they were always there, they were talking, they were in your house, they were judging your future decisions as this team would have them, you believe, and having their input on your life when they didn't. They weren't there anymore and you needed to move on. Their second and better claim is that you can now say goodbye when you couldn't before. Firstly, you know this isn't real, so it is unclear to me, for example, why this pale imitation is going to provide you that closure. They tell us that, for example, you are okay farewelling a grandfather in a coma. I would say that is insufficient for a lot of people, and there was no analysis as to why that would be enough for you. And also, if you don't see it as legitimate, you're unlikely to see that goodbye as legitimate. But we also thought you could also replicate that through ritual in a more effective way. So whilst it might be nice if your partner, as they are dying, says, "I want you to be happy," and move on, many don't. Many don't have good relationships with their partners, and they don't say those things. They say, I am afraid of dying, and I wish you would not take another partner. That's why we thought it was far better that we could replicate things through ritual, that we could have a funeral where you can have an imagined version of that person, where you can eulogize about them in a way that is helpful, how they had these amazing qualities and wanted everyone to be happy, and you could have a united grieving process of that. We thought that was far better than pulling up, resurrecting that person and all their flaws instead of creating a memory of them that allowed people to move on. But also, this was a trade-off. You have to kill this thing, right? So you need to be able to say goodbye. So maybe you did get to say goodbye, but we thought that world wasn't worth it, where you had to pull the trigger and say that you were done. People can't throw out the clothes of their loved ones. Why would they be able to throw out the child that looked like them? We think that people have a strong feeling about not killing their family. Maybe they mitigate it by having a niggling doubt. But I think the overwhelming guilt is never subsumed by that niggling doubt, because if you can get enough resonance out of a goodbye, you can get enough resonance of pulling that trigger to end it as well. We thought this was a perfect mimicry, and for that reason, we thought this would be a perfect form of traumatizing people who were grieving, who were vulnerable, who were already in the worst place they were ever going to be, and we stood to protect those people. So proud to oppose this technology.
I thank the second negative speaker. Can I have the third negative speaker? Third affirmative speaker, yeah.
Is obviously very sad for a variety of reasons. But I think if we think about our own adverse imagination of death and the imagination of our own grieving, the thing that is scariest about it is the fact that we cannot imagine a world with those who make up that world. And an imitation of that doesn't convince you that the world that you love or the world that you feel safe in. It convinces you that you can feel safe for the necessary day or the necessary week, that it takes you to understand what has happened to you. Because we're obviously not asking people to shoot this robot in the face. We're asking people to say goodbye to this person, to this. We're asking people to say goodbye like people say goodbye every day, when they turn off a life support, or when they allow a loved one to opt into palliative care, or they accompany someone to the place where they undergo euthanasia. This is what we allow for the people who are not fortunate enough to have this experience, and the negative team's inability to imagine it in the abstract fails to recognise the ability that humans in these situations do possess, and something that we should entrust them with when they are their most vulnerable. I'm going to ask two questions in this speech. First, will people be able to turn this technology off when it is time? And second of all, will having this technology on provide something valuable? The reason why I'm asking whether or not people will be able to turn this off is that the negative team has made their case, I think, almost entirely contingent on this. Because the reason why you lose your life is that the person is always there. Or the reason why you go crazy or whatever harms it is that you cannot say goodbye, or that will destroy you. What this fundamentally mistakes is not only the power that humans have to understand loss when they are able to contemplate it directly, but also, far less poetically, is the fact that this is a world where people understand this technology exists. In a very simple sense, if this is an adult that you have lost, you will have had to have a conversation with this person about whether or not they consent to being brought back as this robot. So it's not bringing somebody back to life in a way that cannot be imagined. It is a coping mechanism that has been contemplated by two adults or by a family and by society more broadly. And for that reason, it is a coping mechanism people will be able to use at least relatively rationally in the context of their hurt. So why is it that, like mechanistically, is it that people will be able to do this? First of all, it would be recognized as a tool for grief. The person has to have died for this to exist. It's not something that you can, for instance, do after a breakup, and therefore it clearly serves a purpose in your life. It's something that the person, as I said, would have had to consent to, and you would also have to opt into that as something which is useful for you. And presumably it's not like you find out the person is dead and you scream, "Get me an AI." It is something that you are able to talk about with whoever is providing this. You likely would turn to people you trust, such as your family. And the final thing to say here is people are able to let loved ones go, and they haven't shown why this is meaningfully different to, for instance, recognizing that a loved one would be better off in the context of euthanasia, even if that loved one might technically live for longer. So what is the process that we imagine this person turning it off to be? We think that people will be guided through it, and they will have expected it. Yes, they might hold them close at first, but the reason why they will hold them close is that there will have been something that they are missing. They will have missed the chance to say goodbye. They will have missed the chance to alleviate guilt. They will have missed the chance to hold someone in their arms if it is, for instance, a child who was born not alive. We think that that is a process which is incredibly important, and it's not just, and that is a process equivalent to many of the totems of life which we have currently. Note here that the mechanism for being able to say goodbye, in recognizing that it is a totem, is given to you by first and second negative, and that mechanism is the knowledge that this is a pale imitation, is the knowledge that it is being brought in this world for a grieving process, and the knowledge that not only you have that, but that everyone around you has that, and for instance, the grief workers, for instance, the family, will be able to guide you through that, because if you believe that it could be healthy to have this person to say goodbye to, and then say goodbye to them, we think there will be a prevailing social message that this is a reasonable thing to do, and therefore a lot of the harms that this negative team talks about with guilt need to be a lot more concrete in order to counteract what is seen as a reasonable process by the vast majority of the society and the people who would be mean to you, or who would be around you. The final thing they say is, well, the partners would be very mean. This, in the vast majority of circumstances, is not true. People who are dying say to their loved ones that they want them to be happy, or they recognize that they need to move on. And specifically, again, this partner knows that they will be brought back into the life, so you'd have to be a pretty odd person to successfully manage to lie to your partner about how you would respond when you came back from the dead and then be particularly cruel about that. Compare the very unlikely chance that that will happen with our harm, which is the constant fear that they would be cruel to you, which isolates you from other people, which isolates you from moving on, to no benefit of that dead partner and only the harm of yourself. For that reason, people would be able to be moved on, and they would be guided through the process by the very mechanisms that the negative team gives you. So, would this be a good decision? The thing to note here is that we don't need to prove it would be good for everybody. We just need to prove that for the average person who opts into this, it would likely be helpful. As I have explained, they will be able to turn it off, and therefore the process in the meantime will be good. Why is it that people would likely make this decision well? As I've explained, they'll have thought about it. As we explained at second, what is relevant is what they're feeling at the time. So if at the time someone dies, you say the thing that is stopping me from moving on is the fact I never said goodbye, that is a good reason to be able to say goodbye. And we think that for many people, they will correctly diagnose in that moment what it is that's stopping them from moving on in a way that's particularly important to talk about. Note here the other bad decisions that second negative talks about, like suicide and alcoholism. We think that this is nowhere near as bad as that. And if their claim is that these people instead would be locked in a relationship that was not entirely fulfilling, we would far rather people did exist with this imitation if it was the only way to cope. Why is it that it is equivalent to things like grave or things like seeing an emblem of the dead? The first thing we said is it's not about the knowledge that these people are dead. We explained to you that that still existed and you'd likely still have things about funerals. The reason why, for instance, holding a baby is important is that you need to minimize the physical shock of losing someone who makes you feel safe or losing something that you think should exist in order to do the emotional work that allows you to feel safe about that. So for instance, very simply, it is good to be held while you cry because you know you are not alone, and being able to feel not alone because the spirit or some kind of physical presence of a loved one is there, we think is a meaningful process for people who feel abandoned or people who feel shocked in a way which is incredibly problematic. If the worst thing that happens is families who already hate each other fight a little bit more, the fact that families who've had their children ripped from them by circumstances beyond their control now get to say goodbye is something that we absolutely trust people to do and absolutely stand by.
Thank you, third affirmative. Can we have the third negative speaker?
Thanks, Imogen, for making me look tall. We're good? This debate's kind of heavy, so I want to start with the words of the wisest woman that I know, Kesha. She said, "Your love is my drug." And I think that's exactly the right way to think about this motion. Love is a drug. Love is a drug when you say, I want just one more day with you. I want to go out one more time with you. I want to ask one more question with you. And the thing about drug addicts, in the same way that the opposition's characterization works, is it doesn't get any easier to give them up. Because you're a person that went through the shock of seeing your partner die once. You know exactly what it feels like to give them up. And you know exactly, according to the opposition, how bad it is, how absolutely brutal it is to not wake up to them next to you in the bed in the morning. You know exactly how bad it is to not be able to ask them for counsel. And so, the fear of the experience that you've already had replicating itself will cause you to lie to yourself. Assume that everything is fine, but it's not fine, as we tell you. The first question in this debate is, can you consent to this? The second question is, for people who can consent, how important is this choice? The third question is, for people who cannot consent, why do we deny them a good life? How is the choice made? The opposition has like three kind of broad claims here. The first is the idea that this is a thing of which there would be a lot of information and social norms. That is, I think, obviously and intuitively in tension with their material about how we like to respect the privacy and be non-judgmental about the dead. In that context, obviously, you cannot expect people to have good understandings or information. The second thing that we hear is that you know yourself, and that means that you're able to make good choices about your desires. And this evolves in Imogen. I guess the response to that is, you know yourself far less than you actually know. I am a different man to the one that I was 4 years ago. I'll be different again in 20 years. Even if I figured out the things that I wanted, I probably would not know them in 20 years if I had figured them out now. But in addition, this is the kind of thing that people go through very rarely. What unfortunate person has so much life experience that they know exactly what they should do with the robot because they've tried it with and they've tried it without and they know how that works out. Imogen evolves this claim by saying that you're able to have a conversation with your partner so you mutually discuss it with them. Firstly, in that context, context, that radically denies their benefits, because a lot of their things are like, oh, you should be able to ask your partner for permission to go out and date somebody else. Or, you should be able to tell your partner that you love them. But if you're having a conversation in which you're genuinely assessing the consequences of them dying, you're able to have that conversation, which may be very slightly worse in the sense that it's not as immediate because it's not after they die, but is way better because you know they're actually alive. So in that context, there is no benefit for this opposition team. The third thing that we hear is that you have a support network, and that is true, I guess, but support networks are not able to drag an awful lot of people back from the brink. And the opposition selectively chooses arguments when they make their principle. They're like, oh, well, you know, a lot of people are able to make the choice to throw themselves into work. Yeah, and a lot of people don't come out of their rooms. You know, like, your support networks sometimes function for you, but they do not often function well for you. So, we think that this choice will be made well by a majority of people, but a really substantial, or maybe even like a minority, but the number of people who would make this choice incredibly badly would be ones who are incredibly negatively affected. That is to say, we think that the people that are likely to make this choice the least rationally are the people that are experiencing the most the most trauma. Trauma and pain is a strong inhibitor to your ability to make choices appropriately. This is in the same way that we really do not legally allow people to make choices when they're under extreme amounts of physical pain or duress. And in that context, you need to understand that what this opposition team, and by the way, that premise, that essentially some people for whom this is that painful are not able to make the choice to say goodbye, particularly in the context that I give you in my introduction, segregates this debate a little bit. And we also tell you that the bar is high, firstly, because you need to turn them off. So, Imogen is like, oh, it's like things that you do all the time, like dropping one of your loved ones off to a euthanasia clinic. Someone who explicitly asked you to do that multiple times and was in terrible pain, and I would guess that that is still probably the hardest thing that an awful lot of people will do in their lives. It is ludicrous for this opposition team to say that saying goodbye to someone, particularly in a context in which you are going to miss them so much otherwise, is something that is worth protecting. And the other thing, though, of course, that they never rebut is that this is your partner with a personality. This is not your partner with with all of their beliefs and stuff removed. They're not going to ask you to turn them off. You know, you couldn't talk it through with them. You'd need to do it as a secret, and you'd carry that guilt with you for the rest of your life. So everybody who makes this choice suffers by turning them off, but some people couldn't turn them off, and they were the people for whom the grief was too dramatic to overcome. So let's then look at the trade-off that segregates. The opposition says that some people will be able to use this to get over their partners. We can see that that is potentially a marginal benefit, but it is of relatively little importance compared to the devastating consequence that I'm going to describe in the next issue for people who don't consent. Well, in the first instance, these people have a recovery horizon because they're so emotionally well adjusted that they're able to turn these people off in recognition of the fact that it's not good. Secondly, as the opposition explains, this is something that is actually very hard and painful for people. So this is something that is going to be seen as a replica because you chose to make the person and because you chose to invent them, which means it is not going to be of much comfort to you, or at least as much comfort to you as saying goodbye was. Thirdly, we explain, and they explain, that there are other rituals and expectations around death that further mitigate this consequence. And fourthly, we tell you that they are going to be people that have already seen that person die, which means that the memory of saying goodbye to that person will be irrevocably tainted. And what that means is that the benefit that they can claim here is relatively marginal. You give people who are suffering the least amount of grief relative to others on the spectrum the ability to say goodbye in a perverted fashion that does not actually satisfy any of their wants or desires. The opposition's best analysis here is the new substantive at third, which is that it is really important to be held, but I think realistically it is far better for you to get along with it, hug somebody else who loves you, particularly if you've got so many support networks that you're able to consent. That sounds cold, but remember, the better it, like hugging induces serotonin. Right? It's addictive in and of itself, right? Realistically, you're not going to want to say them goodbye after you've held them in your arms and smelled their skin and realized exactly why you love them. If you access that benefit, it's going to hurt you that much more. The opposition said that you can ask them for relationship permission. I've already explained that if you had permission to do this, you would be able to do that. So finally, what are our consequences in this debate? We described that for a substantial majority of people, this stops them ever getting over their partner. And the opposition does not really dispute that. In fact, their characterization is contingent upon the idea that an awful lot of people form life habits and things like that around the lives of these people that live. And that's why our harms were so devastating in this debate, because you grew to dislike the person that you created, but you felt responsible and tied to them all at once. You grew to realize that they were inauthentic, that they couldn't change, but you couldn't say goodbye. And maybe you could after 20 years, but then You'd form, like maybe after a time you were emotionally ready, but then you would form new patterns around the non-development of the person. You denied yourself the capacity for a real human relationship, and that brings with it 5 harms. Firstly, the degree of social stigmatization that the opposition partially responds to, but misses the idea that there are different groups and communities that have different beliefs. Secondly, the idea that it's fake, which means that it's not able to develop in a way that's emotionally meaningful. Thirdly, the fact that it reminds you of the grief and trauma of losing that person in the first instance constantly. It's much easier to look at a new person than somebody that you've already seen or experienced death. And finally, you would perceive it to be incorrect and immoral for minorities potentially, but a large group of people in this debate. And Jimmy concedes that a lot of people will do this when he says that this is a better alternative than dating somebody or having a new child because you miss them. But we explain to you that it is far better for you to move on with a new person because they are an actual, real new person who is able to morally develop and push back on you and challenge you and cherish you and love you. It is, yes, maybe slightly regrettable that grieving people reach out and form new relationships, but I'm so happy for them when they do because the actual consequence of that is it makes it that much easier for people to get over one another. Ladies and gentlemen, I have debated at 5 Australs and I'm not allowed to go back, but I think I just would keep going back and back and back because even as the utility of it goes down and I get older and older and it's more and more inappropriate for me to be here, I love it. And imagine if that was somebody that I actually loved instead of just debating. Thank you all so much.
I thank the third negative speaker to wrap up the negative bench, neg reply.
Grief feels insurmountable, but people do surmount it. We told you the way that you can. You need to, without a robot, you find closure. You gradually let them go. Piece by piece, you can come to terms with having less of them. They forced you to lose it. They forced you to create this closure for yourself. They made you causally responsible for this person's absence. And every time you missed them, it was entirely your fault. I think that's a much more horrific world, and a world when every time you feel that sense of longing, you're going to blame yourself a little bit. You're going to know that was the thing that you were responsible for. And so I think you are much less able to cope with that grief. 2 questions in this reply. The first one is how will people interact with the mimic? The second is how will people interact with the living? I think the question of how people interact with the living is one that they just have not touched, which is a problem. Because I think that's about half of the way that you try and move on by reaching out to people that you cope with. On this first question of how people interact with the mimic, we tell you that people are likely to conceive, they tell you rather, people will conceive it of just being a fake, and so people will just use it and throw it away. But I think that is implausible, as I flagged in my first speech. People are going to see a perfect replica with the face of their loved one, and they're likely to act with it in exactly the same way by their analysis. They told you you were likely to buy into the routines, you're likely to turn to it for a cuddle, for a kiss in the morning, for it to be your caretaker. And so that means you're likely to form those attachments, and it's likely to be really hard for you to turn it off. The affirmative tells you that it wasn't real, and so people might be able to conceptualize of it that way. But as Georgia points out, it really looks real. And so what you end up doing is you have to look in the face of the thing that you were getting rid of, and to you it's going to look perfect. And at that point in time, I think that you are likely to feel hurt when you imagine its absence. Third does slightly more, when she tells you that people miss the opportunity to say goodbye. And this was a thing that they thought was likely to be particularly utile and particularly valuable. But as Beach tells you, you always had more opportunities to do more things with them. You always had an opportunity to make that goodbye slightly better. And so what ends up happening is you can't give it up on it. You feel like you should give up on it, but you can't. The other things that we tell you in Georgia's speech is that it's unlikely to ever be good enough to do this goodbye. Because if they are correct, and you see this as not being entirely legitimate, you don't see the goodbye as legitimate either. And more than that, we tell you the goodbye was a thing that you could satisfy for in other directions, because you could do so in ritual. Eulogies are designed to help people to move on and to cope. The trade-off that I think exists is that if this goodbye is a thing that is meaningful to people, then the execution of this thing moments later is likely to also be meaningful to these people. And at that point in time, it seems likely then that it is likely to hurt people more, because I think that the killing of the thing is likely to hurt you more than the ability to say goodbye would help you. But more than that, we told you that even if the consequence was that you didn't turn it off, that was a thing that was incredibly painful to you, because you always would feel a little bit unfulfilled. The mimic couldn't develop. It couldn't grow, it couldn't change in ways that all other relationships would. And every time it didn't, it had to remind you of that death. It had to remind you of that absence in ways that were likely to make your relationship feel inauthentic and just hurt you. So, I think the ways you interact with the mimic don't help you. On the second question of how you interact with the living, they were entirely silent on this question beyond presuming your support networks would help you. We told you, in fact, support networks are likely to turn away. It is likely to be an incredibly controversial decision to bring this back in the first place. People who are religious, people who just don't think it is wrong, are likely to oppose that kind of decision. And more than that, they were likely to hate you when you turn it off as well, because every person around you was also grieving for this person, and so when those things were taken away, they were also likely to turn away from you then. That mattered because those support networks were able to reach out to you in ways that were really important and really dramatic. But more than that, we told you that in general, you were unlikely to be able to move on with your life and interact with more people. We told you would want to spend time with it because those habits that were meaningful were things that you would likely to continue. And more than that, the thing is likely to feel jealous when you no longer have it. I've spoken in 45 debates at Australs. This is my 5th and last year, and I've never been prouder to oppose a motion.
Thank you, neg reply. And now to wrap up the debate, affirmative reply.
Good, got it. There are two questions in this debate. First, whether the bereaved can consent to this technology, and second, whether it will help or hurt them. Starting with the first issue because it's the fastest way for us to win the debate, because it explains why the set of people who use this technology coincides with the set of people who are likely to benefit from it. The negative team start this issue with some red herrings. They talk about family pressure, to which we explain that this technology will often be used privately and that families make exceptions for grief, as they do when families of differing faiths share a funeral. But their better line of argument is that grief removes our ability to consent. We had 3 lines of response. First, we answered that our proposal required consideration before death in the form of a conversation with the deceased. Second, we said that the grieving can still think about their long-term future, as we see in times of euthanasia or palliative care, especially because they were likely to have some exposure with death earlier in life. And the response from the third negative speaker, that death is private, doesn't deal with the social context of information about death and imposes a standard of consent of personal experience that we require in no other context of society. But our last and crucial response was that even if the bereaved found this technology unfulfilling, they could stop using it. And this is where the negative team becomes very reliant on their line of argument that people will never switch this technology off. Obviously, there was counter-assertions as to the ease of stopping using this technology. The negative said it would be like shooting your child, and we said it was like a final goodbye. Obviously, both of those things are plausible. The reason why you must give this issue to our side is that we have given you reasons to believe our characterization is more likely. Firstly, that people go through the steps of establishing this process, like talking to the deceased, which makes clear that it's a mechanism for grief rather than that person living on. Secondly, that there are other indicia of death, like funerals. Thirdly, that as the negative team reminded us in each speaker's speech, this replica was imperfect. And that exposed an important tension in the negative team's case, between the claim that people would rely on these creatures forever, on the one hand, and yet on the other hand, that they were such poor replicas that people would never find them able to give any fulfillment. Those 3 reasons were never responded to by the negative team, and they established that our line of argument, that people could rationally forego these creatures when they felt that they were ready was more preferable to theirs. That explains why people are able to consent to this technology. Secondly, though, will this technology help or hurt the bereaved? Because even if people can't consent, that merely begs the question of whether the average person would be better off by using this technology. And in particular, I want to deal with the specific group focused on by third negative as the only group who can't consent, those who suffer from extreme and crippling grief. The problem with the negative team's case with respect to those people was one of comparison. They were never willing to deal with the real harms of organic death with no warning. Firstly, that denied people a chance to say farewell to their loved ones. Secondly, that denied people moments of real, practical importance. The negative team's main line of argument was to respond that people would grow increasingly dependent on these people and use them like a drug. But our line of argument was that people could be exposed to the shock of death in other ways, but that exposure to someone to cushion a shock could be a useful way for people to get over a traumatic experience. Just like drug addicts, one might say, go through a halfway house. We explained in many cases that it was easier to deal with the trauma of someone's death when you could still have someone around to comfort you, to tell you that the choices you made in your life were still valid, and that there was still meaning and that you could get past what you're experiencing. The negative's response to this line of argument, that people could have that conversation with someone while they were alive, neglected the fact that that is a conversation very few people have, and also that it is easier for people to doubt whether their former deceased partner would be willing for them to go on with a new relationship when they don't have their physical manifestation telling them that that is their preference. The negative team's case has relied on an implausible and unproven characterization of this technology. We have done the opposite, and that is why we've won this debate.
Thank you both teams for the debate. Can we have another round of applause for the debaters?
To continue with the closing ceremony today, we would like to invite the convener of the Malaya Australasian Intervarsity Debating Championship 2018. Please give a round of applause to Ms. Alison Jong.
Thank you. Good evening and Salam Malaysia Baru I bid to Yang Berhormat Encik Syed Saddiq bin Syed Abdul Rahman, Minister of Youth and Sports Malaysia. Yang Berhormat Datuk Saifuddin Abdullah, Minister of Foreign Affairs Malaysia, cum patron of Malaysian Institute for Debate and Public Speaking, together with Datin Norlin Shamsu. Yang berbahagia Datuk Dr. Abdul Rahim Haji Hashim, Vice Chancellor of University of Malaya, Mr. Tony Nagamaya, General Manager of Malaysia Major Events in the Division of Malaysia Convention and Exhibition Bureau, Professor Dr. Faisal Rafiq Muhammad Adikan, Deputy Vice Chancellor of Development and Acting Deputy Vice Chancellor of Student Affairs and Alumni, Associate Professor Dr. Chandran Somasundram, Chairman of Malaya Austral 2018, cum Executive Advisor of the Malaysian Institute for Debate and Public Speaking, Mr. Yunus Zakaria, Chief Operating Officer of Haro Sports and Entertainment, and fellow participants of Malaya Australs 2018. My good friends, I hope you guys enjoyed the ESL and Open Grand Finals and that dinner is to your liking. I have quite a few things to say and a lot of people to thank, so bear with me. Plus, after this, you won't need to hear me yell at you for not picking up your rubbish anymore, so let's try to do it Austral styles and keep it 8 minutes. UC Malaya has a rich history of participating in Austral since 1992 till date, and this year I am much honored to be the convener of such a prestigious tournament. Malaya Australs is probably the biggest and toughest thing I had to do so far, and the success of this tournament could not be achieved if I was doing it myself. With that, I would like to first thank UC Malaya for the ever continuous support and assistance in making sure we have the facilities and resources for us to run the tournament. Special thanks to Mr. Rosani for making sure we have everything in place, especially at times when I'm anxious and nervous. Your unceasing reassurance always gives me a peace of mind throughout the planning process. Secondly, I'd like to thank the Secretariat Sukarelawan University Malaya, or SECRUM, for volunteering their time during their semester break. They stepped in at the 5th hour to ensure that the logistics and the running of our tournament is as smooth as possible. I can't describe the amount of gratitude I have for the members of SECRUM in ensuring that everyone's welfare are taken care of, regardless under rain or shine. Thirdly, I'd like to thank Malaysia Major Events for their support and contribution to Malaya Austral 2018. Due to their contribution, we were able to provide a better quality tournament for everyone here. And I would like to thank Associate Professor Dr. Chandran, as well as the University Malaya debaters for being with us during the planning and preparation period. The tournament definitely could not function without my dearest adjudication core, Vinodan Kupusami from University of Malaya, Jessica Muslim from Australian National University, Chan Choi from Beijing Foreign Studies University, Mirza Mohammed, formerly from University Technology Mara, Vihashini Gopakumar, formerly from Nanyang Technological University, Tausif Khan from Institute of Business Administration, University of Dhaka, and Daniel Dama from Macquarie University. It was simply a joy to work with each and every one of you, and I'm sure that debaters thoroughly enjoy your motion. A special shout out and thank you to Viran Werasekra from University of Sydney Union. Thank you so much for being my TAP director. I'm eternally grateful for you for stepping in at the last minute. You have been extremely efficient and a joy to work with. I will miss our quirky little chats over the walkie-talkie. A year ago, when I was given the responsibility to convene Malaya Australs, I was undoubtedly terrified. At that point, I had very little experience in tournament organization, so I couldn't foresee what was ahead of me. For the next following months, I felt like a fish out of water. And in order to feel less so, I reluctantly, but always with wonder, learned the beauty and inner workings of Google Sheets. I made friends with late nights and frustrations, and constantly trying to muster enough courage to tell myself, I can do this. There were many sleepless nights that is often comforted by the mornings after greeted by smiling faces from my colleagues when I reached the office. It never failed in reminding me that I am in constant presence of a strong support system. On a bad day, I could heave a heavy sigh, and there will be a hand across the table that will reach mine, and a squeeze of reassurance will always calm me down. I could be in the middle of a panic attack, and in a matter of seconds, I could hear the office chair's wheels slide across the white tiles, and a hug will be delivered to me from its occupant. I've been told that I probably wouldn't be able to pull this off due to my inability to cope with high amount of stress and anxiety. Sometimes it's true, but most of the time it is not. Not only because I told myself to never allow it to affect the planning and execution of this tournament, more so it is because of these following individuals. Izzat Arif, Where's Izzat? Is Izzat here? Izzat Arif, my behind-the-scene partner. While I'm out on stage giving announcements and yelling at you guys, running around convening, it is Izzat, the mastermind behind the coordination of every single round that ensure that each and every one of you get to your rooms on time, eat your lunch on time, and get your dinner on time, and that your welfare is constantly looked after. But more importantly, you have been the most amazing friend and colleague. You would stay up in the office with me till 9 p.m., till 11 p.m., till 1 a.m., till 2 a.m. to hurdle through the storm together. You never failed to reassure me that everything is going to be fine when I keep yelling that the sky is falling. And I know I can trust you when you say that it is not. Mifzal Mohammed, Your words of encouragement and humor, albeit sometimes quite lame, always get me through the toughest part of the day. I'm so grateful and so appreciative of your insights for this tournament, which obviously came from many experiences in attending many majors. Your advice and your wit always eased me in my decision making. Vishal and Harvard, I would be so lost. I would be so lost without your IT expertise. Vishal often makes fun of me because of how old school I am and how slow I am because I prefer writing on paper instead of Google Sheets. My life has become a lot easier during the planning and execution of this tournament because of the new knowledge that was taught to me. Both of you are ever so patient when educating me on how to apply technology in this tournament. I mean, who knew I could send 50 emails at once with this thing called mail merge. I don't even know what mail merge is. Okay. Navinjit and Zara, my beloved younglings. From designing all our posters to coupons to lighting the mood in the office with your youthfulness and glee because the office is filled with oldies like us, our morale while planning Australs is always up with both around you. The team is not complete without you both. Last but not least, Ahmed Faris. I could safely say that I am probably the luckiest Australs convener ever. Your rich experience in convening multiple local IVs, UT Mara Australs in 2013 and Malaysia Worlds in 2015 was crucial in assisting me and mentoring me as a convener of Malaya Australs. You have the ins and outs of a major tournament at the back of your hand, and it's never self-regarding when sharing your knowledge with me. You are the biggest reason to why I no longer feel like a fish out of water. You made it less scary for me by breaking the tournament into smaller pieces of puzzle I need to solve rather than a gigantic one that is beyond this tiny Asian girl. But more so, you understood my every single emotional struggle when planning this tournament. I truly appreciate your partnership, but more so, I appreciate your friendship and love even more. It has gotten me through the toughest part of it all. The Malaysian Institute for Debate and Public Speaking isn't just a small family of 6 debaters and ex-debaters trying to provide accessibility to debating in Malaysia. They will always be first and foremost the family I never asked for and will be eternally grateful for. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Alison Jong. Next, we would like to welcome Yang Berbahagia Dato' IR Dr. Abdul Rahim Haji Hashim, the Vice Chancellor of the University of Malaya, to give his welcoming speech.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera. Yang berhormat Saudara Siddiq Said Abdul Rahman, Minister of Youth and Sports Malaysia. Yang berhormat Datuk Saifuddin Abdullah, Minister of Foreign Affairs Malaysia, come patron of the Malaysian Institute for Debate and Public Speaking, MIDP. Fellow colleagues, debaters, adjudicators, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of University of Malaya, I proudly welcome all participants to the Grand Finals and Championship Dinner of the Australasian Inter-Varsity Debating Championship 2018. We're truly proud to be part of this prestigious tournament. The past few days, we have seen a number of students from various international and local universities and colleges competing amongst each other to be crowned the coveted title of the Australs champion. I believe that this experience has been nothing but fruitful for all debaters, and regardless of whether you have won or not, treat it as an education nonetheless. Ladies and gentlemen, we hope that you have enjoyed the hospitality and the good experience that you have in Malaysia and also at the University of Malaya. I would like to congratulate the finalists for an amazing debate and all the winners here today. You deserve to win, after all, the hard work and effort that you have made and put into the thus far. To those that did not win, do not take it as a discouragement, but take it as a sign to improve and better yourselves for the next year. Before I end, I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Malaysian Institute for Debate and Public Speaking for taking on this initiative to organize this wonderful debating championship, the Malaysia Major Events and Ministry of Tourism and Culture for their support and contribution, the Student Affairs and Alumni, Secretariat Sukarelawan University Malaya, or SACRUM, that has assisted during the tournament, and lastly, to Yang Berhormat Saudara Syed Siddiq Syed Abdul Rahman, and also Yang Berhormat Datuk Saifuddin Abdullah and Miss Alisa Jong for choosing us to be the co-organizer and host. So with that, thank you very much for your kind attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Yang Berbahagia Dato'. To officiate and close our ceremony for today, please welcome the Malaysian Minister of Youth and Sports, Yang Berhormat Encik Syed Saddiq Syed Abdul Rahman.
That's okay. Hello, everyone. It's been a while since I last attended a debate tournament. I believe speaking in politics is a lot easier than speaking to a bunch of intellectuals, especially debaters. Firstly, I'd like to thank the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Datuk Saifuddin Abdullah, who is here with us today. I know that some of you who's not from Malaysia might be thinking, why are there two ministers at a debate tournament? I mean, don't Malaysian ministers have other things to do, especially when it's at almost 11 p.m.? But both of us were debaters before. During my generation, it's Datuk Saifuddin Abdullah, who was the Deputy Minister of Education at that point in time, who upheld the legacy of debating in Malaysia. And now hopefully I'll be able to carry his legacy forward and to ensure that debating will always be a critical sport and dialogue in Malaysia. But I'd like to start by saying what Australs is for me. There are two things. One is Australs is very special to me. One, because I never had a chance to win or debate in the grand final, so it's kind of special in a bad way. Second part is, the other reason why it's special is that I believe I'm still young and I haven't finished my 5-year quota. So in a way, I can still come back and debate in Australs and hopefully win in the future. But on a more serious note, debating has transformed the lives of many Malaysians before, including myself. Before I entered debating, I was this random kid who could barely speak in English. I pronounced the word recipe as recip. At the same time, I thought Africa was a country and Egypt was a continent. But that was me before debating. And hopefully today, I am slightly better from where I was before. But it's not, debate didn't just impact my life in a way in which I became a global citizen. I started to care more about things around me. But I am here today in this very position because of debating. It's one of the unique things of debating in which it reaches out to people who are underprivileged, and it reaches out to people, inspiring them to fight for others out there. I got into politics about 3 years ago, in active frontline politics. And I think to Datuk Saifuddin, there's a story behind it, and one of my debate trainers, Brother Latif, is here as well. One of the biggest reasons why I decided to join active politics is because of debating. When I was a debater and still training IIUM about 3 years ago, when I started speaking up against the government of Malaysia due to the corruption scandal, I was banned from teaching IIUM after. I lost my job as a researcher, but what pissed me off the most is that the government back then attempted to crack down on IIUM, especially the debate club. I remember my friends were threatened. I remember Mubarak Wasi and Mira Natasha Moore and Sarah almost not being able to go to the United States despite already receiving the government funding before due to my action. But I knew from that day onward, what debating taught me is that we all need to have moral courage. That we are here, not just when we argue between the confines of four walls or in a debate competition, but it's when we bring the enthusiasm outside, when we channel our enthusiasm, our public activism into public policy decision making, at the same time in transforming lives of people out there in ways which are very meaningful and concrete. But what I could say is that I also need to thank the previous government for doing what they did, because when you piss off a debater, that debater will not just fight you with words, but that debater will fight you all the way. I'd like to thank the debate community for getting me here today. But with that in mind, I'd also like to take this opportunity to share my vision about debating in Malaysia. While I'm a privileged person to be given the opportunity to debate in Malaysia, to be in such a hospitable community, while I might argue heatedly with people like Mai Mohsen and Mifzal Muhammad, but outside of debate competitions, we are like brothers and sisters. And it is such a hospitable community that it has created multiple different champions locally and abroad. But the vision should not just be shared among debaters who debate competitively in debate competitions. Debating should be democratized. It should be reached, the events and the competitions and the activities should reach out to underprivileged communities and those who might not master English as well as we do. Similarly, when I first started out in debating, my vision for debating in Malaysia is to make Malaysia a debating nation, is to ensure that debating is democratized, to ensure that all universities take up the debate culture, not just to attend debate competitions, but to have weekly and monthly debates on important public issues, no matter how sensitive they can be, from religion to race, from economic issues, so that in the end that their voices will be heard. Is to have more frequent public debates among youth leaders, politicians, academicians, online and also on national television. Is to ensure that politicians actively engage in debates, whether it's popular or not. Is to ensure that debating is mainstreamized to the point that everyone knows it and everyone knows debaters are critical thinkers and are nation builders. But for that to happen, I need your help, especially the fellow Malaysians here, those who are champion debaters, those who are senior debaters, to join hands and hopefully embark in this new journey to democratize debating, to ensure that Malaysia becomes a debating nation. And to the international community, my message is this: debates has transformed lives of multiple groups and people, including myself. I believe it is timely for us to form a unique and formalized cooperation in the way in which debaters could become the voice of reason, the champions of freedom of speech and expression, and form unique international lobby movements in respective countries to ensure that we will fight for the liberation of minorities and groups which need the most assistance, and the voiceless, to be the voice for the voiceless within our respective countries. While some of our countries embrace free speech and expression, other countries don't. But the unique part is there are debate organizations, there are debate groups. They join Asians, Australasians, the Oxford and Cambridge Ivy, and also the World Debating Championship. If debaters across the world take up the mantle of activism, they join politics, they form active lobby movements, and form international partnerships, I'm very sure that we will be able to create history, not just in impacting our very own localized communities, but also to bring change on a global scale. Debaters are crazy people. When I say crazy, we dedicate so much time training debating. We read up on multiple different issues, from football, and for those like me who might not be the best fan of football, I shouldn't say that since I'm a sports minister, but from forcing ourselves to read up and digest about all of that, and at the same time, reading about global politics, knowing complex economic issues. We spend so much time doing all of that. Just imagine how much potential could be achieved and could be realized if we rechannel the ideas and enthusiasm to translate our very own passion into concrete changes in public policy, in politics, and in the nation-building process. If this happens, in the future we will not just be debating among ourselves, but in the future our words will translate into concrete actions, and that actions will change the lives of millions of people. Debaters, you are the change makers, And I look forward to working with all of you, improving the lives of everyone out there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yang Berhormat. Now, the moment we've all been waiting for. Please welcome the adjudication call for the prize-giving ceremony. We would also like to invite Mr. Yunus Zakaria to the stage to present the English as a Foreign Language EFL Category Awards.
We're going to start by announcing the top 5 reply speakers of the tournament. There aren't any medals for those prizes. I guess I'll be off then. There aren't any medals for those categories, but please come on stage and get your photo taken and enjoy the spotlight. Without further ado, the 5th best reply speaker of Australs 2018, with a speaker average of 38.81. From UNSW1, Andrew Mattenhall. The 4th best reply speaker, with an average speaker score of 38.84. From USU5, Kevin Lee. The 3rd best reply speaker of Australs 2018, with an average speaker score of 38.86. From UNSW2, Nick Gerovasilis. The 2nd best reply speaker, with an average of 39.06. From Melbourne 2, Stuart Dixon. And the best reply speaker of the 2018 Australasian InterVarsity Debating Championship with an average speaker score of 39.56. From USU1, James Stratton.
I'd like to announce the top 5 EFL speakers. In 5th, with an average speaker score of 75.69, from NSU1, Mamataz Rahman. The 4th best EFL speaker, with an average score of 75.85, from University of Indonesia 2, Yan Diaz Maulana Siraga. The 3rd best EFL speaker, with an average score of 75.92, from University of Indonesia 1, Ad Fikri Kevin Marvel. second best EFL speaker at Australs 2018 with an average score of 76.25. From IIUM 4, Manasur Jasam. Finally, the best EFL speaker at Australs 2018 with an average score of 76.38 from University of Indonesia 1, Daryl Pramana Tungka.
Thank you very much, Mr. Yunus Zakaria. Next, we would like to invite Associate Professor Dr. Chandran Somasundram to award the top 10 best speakers of the English as a Second Language ESL category.
Moving on to the ESL speaker tab. In 5th position, with an average speaker score of 77, Muhammad Yazid from IUM 3. Ranking 4th, with an average speaker score of 77.12, from Taylors to Deepan Ramanesh Kumar. Ranking 3rd, with an average speaker score of 77.21, from IBA DU1, Sajid Asbad Khondokar. Ranking 2nd, with an average speaker score of 77.33 from IUM 1, Banun Sabri. And the best ESL speaker of Australs 2018 with an average speaker score of 77.62, Selini Basti from IUM 3.
Thank you, Dr. Chandran. Next, please welcome Professor Dr. Faisal Rafiq Muhammad Adikan to award the top 10 open category speakers. We would like to invite once again Dr. Chandran to award the top 10 open category speakers.
We'll now start with the top open speakers. There are 4 individuals tied at 9th. The first of those 4 individuals, from UNSW 1, James Monton Hall. Second out of the 4, from USU 4, Ella Finlay. The third, from Ateneo 1, Katrina Chan. The last person tied at 9th. In addition to being top ESL speaker from IAM 3, Selini Basri. There are two individuals tied at 8 with an average score of 77.71. The first of which, from UNSW2, Nick Gerovasilis. The second individual tied at 8 from USU2, Eden Blair. The seventh best speaker of Australs with an average of 77.88 from Melbourne 2, Stuart Dixon. Ranking 6th with an average of 77.94 from NUS1, Lucas Lee.
The fifth best speaker of Australs with an average of 78.12 from Melbourne to Connor O'Brien. There are two people tied for equal third, both with an average of 78.38. The first of these, from USU1, Jimmy Stratton. The second of these individuals, again, also tied for equal third, also from USU 1, Steph White. The second best speaker of Australs with an average of 78.62 from USU 5, Boston Nolanov. Before I announce the best speaker of Australs and therefore the recipient of the Martin Sorensen Trophy, I'd like to invite a member of the Monash Association of Debaters up to the stage.
The Martin Sorensen's Trophy has a wonderful legacy. It represents the pinnacle of individual achievement by a speaker at the Australs tournament. It carries on the name of many great debaters, but none more important so than Martin himself. As time passes, it is often easy for past deeds to become folklore or mythology, and the temptation exists for exaggeration to take place. But despite the fact that most of the current Monash weren't born when Martin passed, his legacy and contributions are remembered fondly, not as a superhuman, but someone who reveled in his humanity. Although he had an outstanding record, both at high school and at Worlds, as long as internally at Monash, where it is said he never lost a debate, it was here at Australs from 1991 to 1993 that Martin really stamped his authority. From his very first year, he was consistently selected as a member of the Australian team for the test debate and always ranked amongst the top speakers of the tournament. To give you a breakdown of what Martin achieved in his time at Australs, in 1991 he took Monash to its only second ever grand final appearance and finished the tournament as runners-up. In 1992 he led Monash to its first ever Australs victory. In 1993 here in Malaysia, in his last ever tournament, Martin was again selected for the test team. Again, he led Monash to victory and was ranked the best individual speaker at the tournament, winning the award that is now named in his honour. Most people who saw him debate would say that on his day, Martin was one of the best debaters they'd ever seen. He had an ability to communicate complex and sophisticated arguments in such a simple way that you couldn't help but find yourself agreeing with him. Martin could pull apart a case so comprehensively that by the time he sat down at first negative, he pretty much already won the debate. Martin was also an outstanding student, receiving an award from the Economics Institute of Australia for being the best economics student in 1992, and was one of the very few to be granted a scholarship from the Reserve Bank of Australia. However, it was Martin the person, not Martin the debater or the student, who was truly so special.
We all know that debating at times can have its fair share of egos, but in spite of all his incredible talents and successes, Martin remained humble. He treated all people he met, regardless of their level of skill or what institution they were from, with the respect and genuine warmth. As a result, he was well liked and had many friends, particularly from Asian universities, many whom were still emerging on the international debating scene at the time. He would help out wherever he could. If someone needed a debating partner on a training day or an adjudicator for a practice debate, he was always there to lend a hand. For every debate that he never lost, he did this whilst never stacking a team, taking novices and focusing on their development. Martin never built up his own achievements. He wasn't interested in being hero worshipped, but rather preferred to think of success in terms of how much he could help the development of others. He was a firm believer in sharing his knowledge and passing on his talents. The stories of Martin as a coach are of a calm, friendly and patient guy who take you under his wing, give you a few pointers and leave with an intense crease of confidence. Sadly, many never got the chance to know him better and debate with him at uni. 3 days after winning Austral in 1993 and being deemed the best speaker amongst his peers, Martin Sorensen passed away. Martin was a sufferer of cystic fibrosis. He'd been given a relatively short life expectancy from birth. In typical Martin style, he never sought any sympathy nor made his condition public, and very few of his peers actually knew of the health struggles he went through. We should think back and marvel at what incredible strength Martin was as a young man to continue to be so outward focused in the welfare of the development of others, so passionate about the future when he had every right just to focus on himself. It is very fitting that on the 25th anniversary of Martin's passing, Australs is once again back in Malaysia, where Martin had his last tournament. Not only is it the award for the best speaker at each year's tournament, and not only is it named in the memory of one of the best debaters of all time, but it should serve as a reminder to make the most of your time at university as student debaters, to enjoy yourself and to above all contribute to informed public debate in your countries and in your communities.
Now, the recipient of the Martin Sorensen Trophy and the best speaker of Australs this year, with an average of 78.75, from USU1, Imogen Harper.
Dr. Chandran. Moving on to the English as a Foreign Language EFL Grand Finals Best Speaker Award, as well as the EFL Champions and Runner-Ups, please welcome Ms. Alison Jong to the stage.
We saw an excellent debate this afternoon between the University of Indonesia 2 and BHU 1 in the EFL Grand Final of Australasians 2018. In a close debate reflected in a 6-3 split, please join with us in congratulating the EFL champions for 2018, BHU 1. I also want to announce the best speaker in the grand final. And that speaker was the third negative speaker, Anchi Lee. Can we now please welcome to the stage the runners-up of the EFL Grand Final, Indonesia 2.
Thank you, Ms. Allison. Moving on to the English as a Second Language ESL Grand Finals Best Speaker Award, as well as the ESL Champions and Runner-Ups, please welcome Dato' IR Dr. Abdul Rahim Haji Hashim to the stage.
In what was an incredibly closely contested ESL Grand Final between Taylor's University in affirmative and Institute of Business Administration, Dhaka University in negative, in a 6-3 split. The ESL champions of Malaya Australs 2018 are negative Institute of Business Administration, Dhaka University. The best speaker of the ESL Grand Finals in a 4-2-1-1 split was second negative Wasif Khan. Can we now also have the runners-up, Taylor's University, up on stage as well?
Thank you, Dato'. Lastly, for the Open Grand Finals Best Speaker Award, as well as the Open Champions and Runner-Ups, please welcome Yang Berhormat Sheikh Said Sadiq bin Said Abdul Rahman and Yang Berhormat Datuk Saifuddin Abdullah to the stage.
Okay. Hi. So in the Open Grand Finals of Malaya Australs 2018, in what truly was a fantastic debate, on side affirmative, you have Team Sydney Union 1, and on side negative, you have Team Macquarie University 1. Judging alongside me were 8 other individuals. It was Tausif, Amrit, Bobby, Maddie, Jess, Jan, Mifzal, Rafi. On a 5-4 split, your champion for the open category of Malaya Australs 2018 is Macquarie University side negative. Before I announce the finals best speaker, can I have a member from Victoria Wellington to speak on the Jock Fanslow Cup?
Jock Fanslow was a debating legend in Wellington, New Zealand, and throughout Australasia. Representing Victoria University of Wellington, he won Australs in 1980 and 1982, the first person to win Australs twice. Loving the big occasion, he was best speaker of the grand final in both years as well. Sadly, ill health plagued Jock since birth, and a suppressed immune system saw him contract a virus which led to his passing in January 2006 at the age of 48. Jock's debating teammates, friends, and family donated a cup in his name, which was first presented at Vic Australs 2006 and every Australs since then.
I'm good, yeah. So the recipient of the Jock Fanslow Cup and the finals best speaker is second negative Georgia. Can we also have the first runners-up, Sydney Union 1 on stage, please?
Thank you, Yang Berhormat Encik Syed Saddiq bin Syed Abdul Rahman and Yang Berhormat Datuk Saifin Abdullah. Congratulations to all the winners. Thank you to our guest of honors, the Adjudication Corps, and last but not least, thank you to all the participants. This marks the end of Malaya Australs 2018. It has been our greatest pleasure to host all of you. We wish you all the best and enjoy the rest of your night.
Can everyone wait, please? Hey, everyone who's left, come back inside, please. Come back. Someone who hasn't had some explicit thanks yet, who I think deserves it an incredible amount, is the amazing convener of this year's Australs, Ali.
While we're on our feet, I'd like to also give a quick vote of thanks on behalf of the Adjudication Corps to a man whose name you won't find in the tournament guide, but who emerged to be our TAB director, a man of unimpeachable integrity and a tower of debating wisdom, and a TAB master who makes himself a servant of all. Thank you to Viran Wirasakira.
May I have the recipients of the prizes for the Open Champion, the ESL Champion on the side, and the top 10 speakers for the Open category? Can we just get you to the side so we could sort out your prizes? Now, thank you very much.